Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. 25 years ago this past weekend, an agreement was signed on a US airbase outside Dayton, Ohio, ending the war in Bosnia. It brought to an end a 3.5-year-long conflict in which over 100,000 people were killed and in which Bosnian Serb forces seized over 2/3 of the country's territory and put the capital, Sarajevo, under siege. 4 months before the agreement was signed, Ratko Mladic's forces killed an estimated 8,000 Muslim men and boys in and around Srebrenica, a UN safe haven. It was the largest war crime in Europe since the end of the Second World War. Today, we have 3 guests with us to look back at the Dayton Agreement and its legacy, and more broadly, to look at what is happening in Bosnia today. They are Sabina Niksic, who works with the Associated Press in Sarajevo and who covered the war. Hello, Sabina.
Hi.
And we have Louis Sell, a former career US diplomat who served in Yugoslavia before the war and became the first Deputy High Representative in 1997. He was at Dayton for the negotiations, and he's also written a biography on Slobodan Milosevic. Hello, Louis. I think you're in Maine.
I am speaking to you from my home in Maine. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we also have Valerie Hopkins, who is the Financial Times' Southeastern Europe correspondent. Hello, Valerie.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
We've got a lot here to go through, to condense a large swathe of history in order to understand what's happening today. I think I remember you, Louis, talking about history as being like walking through a movie halfway through and not understanding what happened at the beginning of it. So that's partly what we're doing here. I'm going to start with you, Sabina. Can you take us back to the spring of 1992? You were very young then, I think. Can you tell us what were you doing? And did you have any idea at the time that there would be a war in your home city?
I was in high school. I was 17, and there was a lot of talk of war, but we just thought it was a joke, you know. And for people of my generation, we never would have accepted that that was possible. We were even making fun in school, you know, coming in bandages to make fun of the idea that there will be war. And I guess our parents were wiser than us, but I don't think they expected war either until it really happened.
And how did it really start to happen for you? What was your first sort of direct experience of it?
The first well, we had barricades set up around the town by the Serb soldiers, I guess, already. And so you had limited chance to move through the city. That was after the independence referendum. And then it started, you know, the shooting started, the shelling started, the phone lines were cut. For a while there were military planes flying overhead. And it's, you know, at first started something for at that point still was kind of exciting. And it was delaying our test from math. So we kind of appreciated it. 3 months later, we would have done all math tests in the world just to be out of it. But we had no choice but to just live through it for another 3.5, that's actually 3 years and 9 months, I think, exactly.
Louis, I want to bring you in here and actually go back a few years before the start of the war in Bosnia, and in fact, before the start of the war in former Yugoslavia, so before Croatia. If we go back to the 1980s, Slobodan Milosevic is a rising politician. In the mid-1980s, there's this sense of change throughout Europe, throughout Eastern Europe, and certainly by 87, 88 there is. In 1989, you traveled down to Kosovo, where Milosevic was making a really huge speech. Can you just talk about that? But also at the crossroads that Serbia and Milosevic found himself at.
Okay, sure. Thank you. June 28, 1989, Milosevic went to Kosovo, to the field Gazimistan. That's the 600th anniversary of the defeat of the medieval Serbian Empire by the invading Ottoman Turks, which the Serbs, oddly enough, celebrate as their national holiday. For the Americans on the call, it'd be sort of like if we celebrated Pearl Harbor as our national holiday. But they do, and Kosovo has this kind of near mythical status in the Serb national psyche. Milosevic went down there to give one of the most important speeches of his life. I was there. Milosevic had banned the American ambassador from going. He didn't like us much by then. We were starting to raise the issue of human rights violations in Kosovo. So he invited the whole diplomatic corps to come down to see his speech. He disinvited the American ambassador. He forgot to disinvite me. So I drove down and was there along with about 1 million other Serbs had come to this field. Almost all of them bussed in from out of Kosovo, Serbia proper, where many places where Serbs lived throughout Yugoslavia, waiting to hear Milosevic. He was delayed. We later learned he was delayed because they had rumors of an assassination plot on his drive down. So he came by helicopter. And people were waiting in the midst of this very hot day for hours, drinking water and other substances, getting impatient. Milosevic descended from a helicopter, kind of like an avenging angel. This huge roar went up from the crowd. And Milosevic got onto the platform. At that point, he was in the midst of efforts to carve out a new entity. Slobodan Milosevic, when he began his rise to power in Serbia, it's pretty clear what he was trying to do was to take over all of Yugoslavia, all of socialist Yugoslavia, become in effect a new Tito is a kind of a slogan. That effort failed. It was beyond his power. Serbs were a plurality, but not a majority. Milosevic was able to gain control of 4 of the 5 republics in Yugoslavia, but not all of them. And he switched pretty seamlessly to a new objective, which is basically to destroy socialist Yugoslavia and create this new entity. All Serbs should live in one state. All the Serbs who lived in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Kosovo should live in one state, which he, of course, would control. So he's in the midst of that shift. He gets to the platform and he gives this speech, which is a hymn, basically, to socialist Yugoslavia and brotherhood and unity. All of the peoples of Yugoslavia living together. And that was not, we learned later that a little good of that speech was written by his wife, Mira Markovic, and she was a convinced communist, unlike Slobodan Milosevic. And the crowd was getting restless. Brotherhood and unity was not what they wanted to hear. And Milosevic, sensing that or got to the right point in the speech, he shifted gears and he said, in effect, he started talking about Serbia and its place in the Yugoslavia. And he said, we're in the midst of conflicts which are happening as a result of the Serbia's effort to claim its rightful role in the country. Those conflicts are peaceful, but it cannot be ruled out that they will not be peaceful in the future. In other words, that there will be war. And he knew quite well he knew that what he was trying to do was going to create war. There was no way to do what he could do without war. And that's what the crowd wanted to hear, that the possibility of war. And there was this huge roar from 1 million Serbs. Never forget that. Anyway, that's what that, and Milosevic then went on, in fact, to try to carve out all Serbs live in one state, and the war began, as you alluded to, in 1991.
Yeah, so there was a 10-day war in Slovenia, over and done with very quickly. Then was a longer and nastier war in Croatia, 91 to 92, and the Serbs basically take a long strip of territory going from Serbia across northern Bosnia, almost down to the Adriatic coast, and they retain that territory right through to Dayton. Now we have to sort of forward wind fairly quickly to 95. Essentially, during that time period, Europe does not want to intervene in this conflict. It only deals with it in the humanitarian form, delivering of aid, food. That's what we see going through Sarajevo. And there's strong resistance, particularly from France and from the UK, in any form of intervention. That policy changes basically in 1995. And then we get Richard Holbrooke pushing through negotiations, and that ultimately ends up with Dayton. Louis, can you talk about that experience at Dayton, but also we come back to Milosevic. Milosevic, the man who has launched Yugoslavia into this conflict, is now the man that the world deals with to try and secure the peace.
Right. So, I mean, we're talking about a movie. It depends now exactly where in that movie you want to start. Maybe the best way is spring and summer of 1995. In some ways, I had just more or less finished up 4 years and 3.5 years in Moscow, and I ended up being asked to come back to serve as a political advisor to Carl Bildt, former Swedish Prime Minister, who had taken over as the European and UN negotiator for all of the former Yugoslavia, for all of those conflicts in the former Yugoslavia that remained open still at that time. So I started working for Carl. Carl was given the task of picking up from former British Foreign Secretary David Owen, who had resigned in the spring of 1995 after spending 3 years heroically creating plan after plan for solving Bosnia based on a series of maps, none of which ever succeeded for a variety of reasons. Carl was given that task and set about it. And at the same time, basically, the international intervention was collapsing in Bosnia. Bosnia, from 1992 to 95, there had been a UN peacekeeping force in Bosnia. It was the largest peacekeeping force the UN had ever created up to that time. Its two largest troop contributors were Great Britain and France. Each of them had more than 10,000 troops on the ground. The US had 0 troops on the ground, had resolutely refused to get involved in the UN peacekeeping effort, although we had promised to provide air cover to it if they needed it. I'm going
to force the issue here because we've got to try and move over a lot of territory in a short amount of time.
Understood.
Basically, those troops, the Europeans, or the UN in particular, was very defensive about being too interventionist. The fear was within Europe that those troops would be seen as hostage. Indeed, some of those were taken as hostage. The US, and Holbrooke take a much more aggressive tack, ready for airstrikes. The embargo, it's called lift and strike. The arms embargo is lifted. There's a big pushback against the Serbs, and at the same time, the Serbs are essentially forced to the negotiating table. And at that point, what I'm trying to get to, though, is the agreement that comes out of that negotiation, the agreement that sets up the government of Serbia today, or Bosnia and Republika Srpska today, and then Bosnia-Herzegovina.
All right, 30 seconds and then to Dayton. What critically changed things was Srebrenica. Srebrenica changed everything, as you alluded to, the massacre of 8,000 Bosnian men and boys, the international intervention, everyone involved, and it discredited the whole. It was a shame and disgrace, and it finally in Washington, finally Bill Clinton said enough is enough. we, the United States has to get involved in a way to try to end it. Europeans who had been, in a way, urging the United States to do more for several years, welcomed that, more or less, not necessarily agreeing with everything, but the U.S. launched this shuttle diplomacy led by Holbrooke in and out of the capitals of Bosnia, the Yugoslavia. Carl Bildt and the Europeans, me as his advisor, still in a role, also a shuttle diplomacy, but distinctly in a secondary role, a bit of international tension there, but it ended up in Dayton. All right, this conference in Dayton, which was in a way not ever done before. People have tried to recreate it since. The French said in 1998, with Kosovo, they were going to have a conference in Rambouillet was going to be just like Dayton, but with better food. That didn't quite work. But the U.S. brought all of the parties together, every one of them. Sorry.
They cut them off from the outside world, and Holbrooke essentially forced an agreement.
Holbrooke and the U.S. team, with the Europeans helping, brought the parties together. Said, you're not going to leave until there is an agreement, or until we decide that there can't be an agreement, and we'll wash our hands and people knew the conflict would resume. And so I think it was November 21, the agreement was signed. Dayton had two purposes. One was to end the war. This war was spinning out of control horribly in July of 1995. In November of 1995, it ended. So Dayton succeeded in doing that. And I think it's been 25 years. There's not been a war. And honestly, I don't think anyone in Bosnia really wants a war again. In 1990, there were people in Yugoslavia, as we alluded to, who actually wanted war. I don't think anyone wants war anywhere in the former Yugoslavia now, although wars can begin with my miscalculation. So that's an enormous achievement. The second goal of Dayton was to create a structure of governance, create an internationally recognized Bosnia, preventing Milosevic from his objective of all Serbs in one state, breaking up Bosnia, a greater Serbia, however you want to define it, and creating the framework by which the peoples of Bosnia could create a sustainable democratic system of incorporating, let's say, the best multi-ethnic traditions of Bosnia.
Okay.
And in that, it has not succeeded.
We're going to come back to that in a second. We're going to talk about that structure of government that is immensely complicated. And some people blame for the stasis, the lack of progress, or many people blame for the lack of progress in the country today. We'll come back to that in a second. But before we do that, Valerie, I want to turn to you. You cover Southeastern Europe at a time when most international newspapers have pulled back from the region. The FT is the only one, you are the only correspondent who's doing regular coverage for an international broadsheet. So it's great to see your stories there. Can you tell us about what you found when you were there this summer? And I'm particularly interested in and around Srebrenica, where these 8,000 men and boys were killed in 1995, in July 95.
Thank you so much, Nick. Well, and as you said, it's a big pleasure to get to work for one of the few newspapers that does have a permanent correspondent who's covering the region. I traveled. I spent 10 days in Srebrenica this summer, reporting on the aftermath, the 25th kind of the commemoration of the genocide, and it was quite. It was quite difficult. I mean, first of all, it was a COVID situation. So I think it was my 5th commemoration in Srebrenica. I was there for the 20th and several of the other ones. in the intervening years. And so it was quite difficult because it was small, and many survivors and family members of the deceased and missing were unable to attend. But what I found, it was the first time that I really stayed for many days afterwards. And what you find afterwards is quite different from the commemoration, which you know is in many ways a gathering and a show of resistance and a show of defiance that people are still there. And because what happens in the days and weeks afterwards is that the town empties out, and it's so empty, in fact, that you know, I think that there were several hotels before. They're now all closed. Most of the cafes and restaurants that used to exist are closed, and many people have left. What's interesting about Srebrenica, and what I find very unique, is that unlike most towns and cities in Bosnia, which were ethnically mixed before the war, it's one of the few that has really remained that way, in which people are really living side by side. A lot of people talk about Mostar being a divided city, or some of the other bigger towns being split, but in Srebrenica, it's really, nobody knows the exact balance of residents, because a lot of people register there that don't live there, including many Serbs who live across the border, actually in Serbia proper, but still retain the right to vote. I don't want to get too lost in the details, but it's quite interesting because, and I tried to explore this in my magazine piece, of the uneasy coexistence there, and the necessity for cooperation and collaboration. You know, there's only one soccer team. There are so few businesses and shops, and in many of them are ethnically mixed, right? And yet at the same time, there is a big inability to talk about what happened. And I think an entire generation, you know, goes to school very confused because their teachers don't really teach them. But that's Srebrenica itself, which is very unique from all of the towns and villages surrounding Srebrenica. You know, in neighboring Bratunac, which is a 5-minute car ride away, on July 11th, which is the annual commemoration of Srebrenica, there was also held, I think maybe for the first or second time this year, a party held by a pro-Russian political actor, a party celebrating the liberation of Srebrenica, you know, which is something that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. I would like to think not even 5. So there is as well, you know, there was a big picture of Ratko Mladic celebrating. I don't know that the party was incredibly well attended, but the posters were everywhere, and it shows a division about how people think about what happened. There was also, and there were Serbs, I should point out that there were Serbs during the war in Bosnia that were killed in the area of Srebrenica and the region. Certainly not nowhere close to as many Bosniaks, but there were. And the Bosnian Serb government is kind of supporting and promoting this climate of denial. It has overturned reports, like official inquiries into what happened in Srebrenica that were adopted in Banja Luka, the de facto capital of Republika Srpska, and it's writing new ones in an attempt to equalize the victimhood. In a way to
for me, this is quite shocking in a way. I mean, I covered the region initially from 1999 to 2003 for the BBC, and then I covered it for the New York Times from 2004 to up to 2008. And during that time, there was a sense of rapprochement. You had Boris Tadic apologizing for what had happened in Kosovo. Even Dodik had had basically recognized in some form what had happened in Srebrenica. And then you saw a big rolling back going on from this. Sabina, just turning to you now, is this, am I right in saying so? Does it seem as though things have got worse in terms of that? Here we are 25 years later, you'd expect, well, I would have expected things to have got better, not worse.
Well, yeah, I would have expected that too, and I guess pretty much everyone would. But I also think one of the things that's important to say is that if you go and talk to ordinary people, and I'm sure Valerie, I mean, I'm not sure, but I guess when you talk to people of different ethnicities, you know, work together, they even talk about what happened, and they they're never going to go all the way into this conversation, but there is some basic understanding. But it's not popular, because the Dayton Agreement, while immensely successful in stopping the war, this structure it created, the centralized state, it basically it entrenched ethnic divisions. So for political leaders, it became, to be successful, they need to estrange others and appeal to their group. So even Dodik, who today we would all agree is this loudest of all nationalists, although I'm not really sure he's a nationalist in his heart, just like Milosevic, I'm sure I wasn't. They're just opportunists. It's just popular to tell this story, to deny these crimes.
Can you just explain to people the actual structure? So we've got Republika Srpska on.
So what we have the country is divided into two parts that are highly autonomous. Each has its own parliament, its presidency, its government. One is controlled by the Serbs, run by the Serbs, and predominantly Serb now in terms of population. The other one is shared by Bosniaks and Croats. And that the other one is subdivided into 10 so-called cantons. And each of them has its own local government. So we, for example, and then there is, like the central government that links the two, but which is pretty weak, and it's mostly, foreign policy, foreign exchange, economy. For example, this country doesn't have a single health ministry. We don't have a single agriculture ministry. We don't have a single education ministry. But what we do have, and we're at 3.5 million people right now, we have about 130 different ministries. We have 14 different governments. We have 9 presidents. So it's, our administration and our public spending eats about 40% of our GDP.
Wow. So, but Sabina, just to give this some context, how does this affect you and your life? And if I want to make a comparison, if you were growing up in the late 80s or 90s and you lived in Poland or the Czech Republic, I guess you had expectations of peace, prosperity. If you're going to compare yourselves to them, or even to Romania and Bulgaria, which were definitely the poorer cousins of your former Yugoslavia, how would you say your life has fared?
Well, I'm not really a good example, because I'm pretty fortunate in my life. So I mean, there isn't much I would complain about. But most of the people I know, that we were, Yugoslavia was pretty liberal by comparison to all these other countries you've mentioned. We were not behind the Iron Curtain. We traveled freely. We were getting decent education. We did have this sense of brotherhood and unity, or at least that was like, most of the people I know truly believed in that. And so, if somebody asked me to imagine where I'm going to be in 1990, I guess I would see myself as being, pretty affluent, highly educated, living, and in a democratic society, because, being closer to Germany than to
Valerie, can you just give us the sort of the key economic indicators? How does the average Bosnian life fare to even somebody in Croatia or Slovenia, for example?
I don't have all those numbers off the top of my head, but I can tell you that the GDP per capita is just $6,000 US dollars, right? So, and from that, all of these 13 governments and 9 presidents and 130 plus ministries need to be financed, right? I think the thing that's important to remember is that, that has sent people leaving in large numbers. I think that 5% of Bosnia's population has left in the last 5 years. So a lot of people are joining the EU, one by one with their feet. And that has left a really dramatic demographic decline. 2/5 of employed workers are over the age of 50. 1 in 5 Bosnians is a pensioner. It's not a great, I think many people don't necessarily feel a perspective. At the same time, 70, I was reading some statistics as well that 75% of the population is proud of being Bosnian. Like there are also positive things, and including in Republika Srpska, 66% of the population are proud to hold a Bosnian passport. And I think that is an overwhelming success, actually, considering the amount of propaganda and negativity and regular rhetoric against the unitary, against Bosnia within its borders that they've been subjected to. But still, it's hard to succeed as a
increased Russian intervention in the region, and also Chinese as well, which were not in favor of a united Bosnia or membership of the EU. Indeed. And also not in favor of Bosnia's perspective for an EU. A lot of the Chinese investments, for instance, are not in line with a lot of the European climate indicators or tender procedures, and they're running up the country's debt. But it's much easier to get politicians to agree to those terms of the deal, because they're cheaper in the long run. Yeah, I'm going to come back to Louis in just a second. We've raced through a huge amount of history. We've covered some really complex issues. I mean, talking about Bosnia's constitution and sort of governmental arrangements are really baffling. I mean, we do stuff on Lebanon, and Bosnia's much more complex than Lebanon in some respects. So please do start putting your questions in the Q&A box, everyone, and we can put these to our panelists. Louis, did you think that when you were creating this agreement and negotiating it, did you think it would be there for 25 years? Clearly, when you were setting up the constitution and the way you got the Republika Srpska and the federation on the other side, did you think those were permanent structures? Could you see a more unitary Bosnia, and were you envisaging one?
I'm confident that if you had asked anyone at Dayton the day it was signed, would the Dayton Agreement and the Dayton Constitution still be in effect unchanged a quarter of a century later, people would have expressed, would not have believed it, and would have not welcomed it. So I think it's a surprise. I mean, the Constitution is really, when people want to talk about the failures of Dayton, it's really the Constitution primarily they focus on, although other things as well, like refugee return. The Dayton Peace Agreement was a coerced agreement in some ways. There was military, diplomatic, and economic pressure put on all of the parties in varying degrees to come together on that agreement. But it was also a negotiation among those parties. It wasn't dictated to defeated nations. And at Dayton, probably the Dayton is an umbrella agreement with 11 annexes. Annex 4 is the Constitution. I worked a lot on that, and I was one of the areas where the Europeans had a lot of input. I was called an honorary European, by the way, at Dayton by Carl. Anyway, and all of the party, they cared about the Constitution, and that was a negotiation. There was a draft. We produced, I mean the European, I helped write the first draft, our draft. We gave it to the Americans. The Americans more or less ignored most of it, but came up with their own draft. And then the parties came together, and there was very much a negotiating dynamic quite different from the one in the war. And it was the Serbs and the Croats together, with on the other side tending to be the Bosniaks or the Muslims. The Bosniak side wanted the most centralized structure possible, and the Croats and the Serbs wanted the most decentralized possible. The Croats would have liked to have had their own entity, but that was not in the cards, and they didn't really try to do it at Dayton. Eventually, what emerged was what the traffic would bear.
Yeah, okay. I want to say something here too, and just sort of put my oar in, which is I think for many people, if you're in the UK or if you're in Australia, it's something which doesn't immediately, it's not apparent that the incentive of joining the EU is really the glue that ostensibly keeps the Western Balkans together. Without that idea of belonging to this bigger bloc that gives you security and wealth, there's greater insecurity and risk of conflict with your neighbors. And that promise was made at I think the Treaty of Lisbon a long time ago, but it's taken a very, very long time. Croatia is the most recent country to join the EU, but it doesn't look like North Macedonia, Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Kosovo are going to join for some time. And I think that is one of the huge questions. And now you're seeing those leaders, many of those leaders, so if we take Vučić in Serbia, moving away from that and basically saying, Russia's backing us, we might join the EU, we might not join the EU. So that presumption, that idea that's of glue that's sticking everything together is sort of being whittled away, and particularly as you see people like Viktor Orban and Hungary coming to the surface. So, I didn't envisage this kind of situation taking place, and it really does mean in some ways that the clock is ticking, I think, for the Western Balkans if Europe doesn't embrace the region as it has promised. Jim Lowenstein, you've got a question that follows up on this, I think. Jim.
Unmute.
Jim, but just say what your background is, Jim, because you were in Yugoslavia before any of us were.
Well, my background is that I was in Yugoslavia for the first time in 1950 when I was assigned to the Marshall Plan, and there was the Yugoslav offshoot for that. So I spent 6 months in Bosnia. I was not only the only American in Bosnia, I was the only foreigner in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I was 22 years old. Then in the early 60s, I was in the embassy in Belgrade for 3 years when Ambassador Kennan, first with George Kennan as ambassador, and then with Burke Elbrick. And then in January 1996, right after the Dayton Agreement, I went back to Bosnia as a part-time volunteer with the OSCE, which leads me to my question. One of the things that I did shortly after I arrived in 96 was I was assigned to go up to the Republika Srpska and get Mr. Koljević, who was then, I think, either president or prime minister, and bring him back to Sarajevo for a ceremony. And on the way back, Koljević had taught in an American university. He was totally bilingual in English. We had a long talk about the future of the Republika Srpska. And he said, in the long run, I think the Republika Srpska will be part of Serbia. Now, my impression today is that the Republika Srpska has never given up on that point of view, that they are really the great troublemakers in Bosnia because they don't want to remain in Bosnia. They want to be part of Serbia. What do you think, Lou?
So let's ask Sabina on that one, because there have been two sets of elections that give interesting replies to that. So let's talk about Dodik, Sabina, and then also talk about the municipal elections, Sabina.
Okay, to be honest, I think yes, on the surface you would say that Republika Srpska never wants to be part of Bosnia and it wants to be part of Serbia. But I think in reality, I'm not sure that's true anymore. And I'm in particular not sure Serbia would like Republika Srpska to have anything to do with it. That's popular. It's just, like that's what makes our politics function, to be divisive when you're in office, to estrange people, to stoke fears. And all of that is, and then even the promise of EU membership, it's just when you listen to people and when you do, I mean, you can never, believe public opinion polls, but I think that there is a general sense that majority of people here would like to be part of the EU. Our politicians just declaratively want to be part of the EU because the system as it is enables complete state capture. The level of corruption is just amazing. And it's becoming so, they don't even try to hide it, And
so if they introduce the EU reforms, they basically undermine the money stream that's coming to their pockets.
Yeah, and it's like, but it's like in our case, we I think we're emerging at the other end, where nationalism is so bizarre, and it's used to hide so many other things that it's becoming laughable. So last local elections we had, it doesn't have to mean anything, but it can mean a lot. What happened? It was preceded by one of the most wild campaigns that you could think of in recent years. And everything was, portrayed as the matter of us against them. But it also came, after months of pandemic, and where we had public procurement deals throughout the country that were so obviously wrong that there's something like, for example, we purchased 100 ventilators from China for a price that was at least 2 times higher than it should have been. And they were imported into the country by a food processing company that's owned by, popular TV anchor or something that didn't have license to import medical equipment. It was linked, this deal, with the prime minister of one of these two parts, the federation, with like various people in the government. And it was, so then when they came, these ventilators, they don't even meet the minimum standard for use in ICU.
Sabina, let's turn to Valerie on this. If on the EU side, the EU's got so many other things to be concerned about. Enlargement has gone off the boil some time ago. Isn't there a sense that the EU could do more to advance change and reform? But if you go back a few years, it seemed to be contingent on Republika Srpska and the Federation basically agreeing to these reforms together, and they never would.
Well, indeed. I mean, I think the scope of this call, we don't have enough time to speak about all that the EU has and hasn't done in the Balkans. But I mean, it's certainly a two-way street, but they have a lot of coercive power. I mean, for all of the countries in the region, the EU is the largest and most important trading partner. And I have the distinct impression that quite often the EU doesn't use the tremendous power that it has. It can be very accommodating. For instance, I remember, and I don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but I remember there was a period when Milorad Dodik, who was one of the power brokers of Republika Srpska, who is now president at the state level and often blocking a lot of state level activities, was refusing to sign some part of the pre-accession agreements and threatening to send all of the foreign judges and prosecutors that at the time were working in the Bosnian courts home. And rather than tell him, that this was ridiculous, that this wasn't going to happen, and that Republika Srpska wouldn't get the EU money promised, former High Representative Catherine Ashton flew in her helicopter to meet him and had a reception and treated him as if he was as important as a state level leader. And I think that this type of experience is quite telling. I just think quite often Brussels can underestimate their coercive power. At the same time, it's becoming increasingly difficult for EU ambassadors, for European politicians to continue to credibly tell any of these countries that they have a European perspective. And I know we're talking about Bosnia and not North Macedonia, but the fact that North Macedonia went through the tremendous effort of changing its name so that it could unblock its process and has now been blocked by another member state sends a terrible signal to the rest of the countries in the region. And I think slowly but surely there will need to be a broader...
Just very briefly, who was North Macedonia's application blocked by and why, very briefly?
Oh, sorry. So North Macedonia's application was blocked for 27 years by Greece because the Greeks believed that the name Macedonia, it was just then Republic of Macedonia, implied territorial ambitions to the Greek territory of the same name. And there's also there's also technically a Macedonia in Bulgaria, Pirin, Macedonia. And now the Bulgarians have found some objections to the North Macedonia's application because of their language and history.
We'll come to Hilary Matthews in just a second, but I saw you nodding there earlier, Louis. I mean, basically the lack of, well, it's not a lack of sincerity, but the EU's inability to deliver. Was that what you were thinking about?
Oh, I was thinking about a lot, but I think you're absolutely right that what the EU perspective of being a member of Europe is critical for the future of that country. And I think Bosnians have always recognized that. I remember during the period of shuttle diplomacy, once Carl and I and his team, we were in this is the war still going on. At the same time, Holbrooke and his team were there. And there's this big kerfuffle down in one of the squares. And the Bosnians all rushed to the American team. And they were all up, brought the American team onto this podium. And Carl was kind of standing there by the side and looking on. And I went to one of Izetbegović's advisors. He'll remain anonymous at this stage. And I really lost my temper as an honorary European, right? And I grabbed him and I said, Carl Bildt is the European here, and Europe is your ticket to the future. You should not ignore this man. Mirza was a smart, smooth operator. He understood that and brought Carl up to the symposium. And I'm not trying to make myself some kind of a hero, but even then, the Bosnians understood the importance of a European's perspective. However, and here I really think that the European accession process is broken. Macron is right when he says that. Whether he's sincere or not in wanting to fix it, I'm not completely sure. But it needs to be fixed. And the people in Bosnia and Kosovo and North Macedonia need to have some perspective that they can join Europe in their lifetimes. At least in Sabina's lifetime, if not in mine. And that's right now, you'd have to say not likely.
It seems such an abstract concept to the rest of us when we're thinking about COVID, and previously there'd been the financial crisis. Most people in Europe do not realize or think about or are interested in the prospect of European enlargement, yet its importance to that region and its long-term peace and stability is huge. But it's a very difficult thing, I think, for politicians to want to engage. It doesn't have any bonuses for them, really. Hilary Matthews, you've got a question. Go ahead, Hilary. Go on, Hilary. Go on, Hilary. Hilary, can you hear? I can't. Your microphone's open, but we can't seem to hear you. So I'm going to ask Hilary's question for her, because I can see it written down here. How do ordinary Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians view each other in non-COVID times? Do they move across borders easily? Sabina, maybe you can talk a bit about this. Who lives where? What kind of relationships? Is there a lack of understanding? It depends where you live and who you are in a way, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't like to oversimplify this, but we are not aware of any border existing that's running through our country. We move back and forth, people hold concerts, attend concerts, in one part or the other. People work together, they do deals together. If you didn't ask them to self-identify, you wouldn't know who they are because we all look the same. We all talk the same. So I think people, and I might be naive really, but I think people here find it relatively easy to live together, to work together. We don't intermarry so much as we did before. We don't date as much as we did before, but we still intermarry and date from time to time. I think people would find a way to live together, and it would be much easier if they were not part of this maddening system where, for your political leaders, they need to be antagonistic to others and to keep you afraid in order to succeed. So
yeah, because essentially the cantonal system and the RS and the federation on the other side reinforce those ethnic divisions, and therefore ethnically led parties are the parties that people vote for, and they're the parties who create the patronage. Valerie, you wrote an article, I think it was in the magazine. There was a 17-year-old, I think in Potocari, who talked about she was Bosnian Muslim. She had an uncle and a grandfather who'd been killed in Srebrenica, but it wasn't something that she wanted to talk about with her friends, her Serb friends.
Yeah, I found her very interesting, and I can't say that I did an exhaustive poll of 17-year-olds living in Srebrenica and Potocari, but she was very clear about the fact that she had friends from all types, that she didn't cause problems. She went very often to Bratunac, the same town that I mentioned, where there was that celebration of war criminal Ratko Mladic. And she said that she was open and could share everything, but to a point, that she didn't necessarily, her friends didn't ask and she didn't really tell. But I said, but do you think they know? And she said, well, we all have the internet. They know what happened, and their parents know what happened. And I think, more to Sabina's point, even in Srebrenica, for instance, one of the cafes that is open is actually run by a couple who one is a Bosniak and one is a Serb. There are many, I don't want to be just another one of those journalists that goes to Srebrenica looking for positive stories, but there was another person in the magazine story, who has a rock band. He's a Bosniak and he has, Serb drummer. The same thing with a music school there. So there are also, I think, ordinary people, good people, and most of the people that I've met in my decade in the Balkans are good, find ways of interacting with and working with one another. But it's when they run up against the system or some officialdom that problems can be caused. Yeah, and I just wanted to make one comment also about what Louis said, is that I think Dayton, and I think also the last period and this recent traumatic period that we've witnessed in my own country, all show the degree to it, and what's happened during these last 4 years in the Balkans show the degree to which actually in the Balkans a tremendous amount can be achieved when the US actually works in concert with the EU. I mean, I think, pressure, the Lewis story is case in point, pressure on the different leaders from the Balkans to make European improvements that the EU wants but can't always promote is really the only way. And I think it's a big opportunity now that Joe Biden is coming back to the White House. He knows the Balkans incredibly well, spent a lot of time there, was a big advocate for the interventions in the 90s in both Bosnia and Kosovo. And I'm really curious to see what kind of team he assembles to deal with the region.
Louis, I mean, do you have any optimism with the Biden administration? I mean, it's a different generation of people in the State Department now, but what's your instinct? Do you think you'll see more progress, do you think?
Well, we couldn't help but see a better situation and more progress than we've seen in the past 4 years out of my country. But I think Joe Biden is obviously deeply experienced and cares about foreign affairs. He has a certain amount of experience in the Balkans. He visited Bosnia in 2009. I think he was the last senior American official to do so. He's vice president then. Same in Kosovo. I think I think that the Balkans and Bosnia is not going to be the top item on Joe Biden's foreign agenda, but I think he will be open to the notion that it is something that the international community, with the United States and Europe working together, does need to tackle, and I think you'll probably find good people to do that. Then it becomes the issue of, all right, what do you do? And I think maybe for us internationals, a little humility is in order. Particularly from Americans. I don't want to say particularly from British either, but we've been telling people in the Balkans and elsewhere how to order their lives, and in some cases helping them do that. Sometimes it's been good. I mean, a lot of it that has been good, not always as successful as we'd like. One of my European colleagues, a senior UN official with lots of experience in the area, once said something to me as we were talking. It's very thoughtful. He said, in the Balkans, look at the two countries in the Balkans that are sort of farthest behind in creating their own sustainable country, farthest behind in overcoming the consequences of the conflict, kind of farthest behind in Europe, whatever. What are they? Kosovo and Bosnia. They are also the two countries in the Balkans which have had the most sustained and continued international engagement. Uncounted billions of dollars, military personnel, civilian personnel, uncounted plans, how to shape things. Maybe it's time for us to step back and to ask the people of Bosnia, what do they really want? And then maybe help them to do that. Now, I'm not totally sure what their answer would be, actually. But maybe it's time for us to adopt not a dictative, coercive role, but a facilitative role. And the first question is, okay, guys, gals, what is it that you want?
But Sabina, doesn't that play straight into the hands of people like Vučić in Serbia, who are very happy to play up the nationalist, the parties that are there are just waving the flag anyway. So it just gives them more leverage.
Well, if anyone was, coming in to change the situation or to ask the people in this region, what is it that they want? Maybe we should start by, by asking more simple questions. So rather, do you want to have a constitution like this or division like this? You just ask them, would you rather that the corruption doesn't eat half of your paycheck and that you have decent healthcare and decent education? When you present the argument like that, I think pretty much everyone would have the same answer. And to basically start openly talking about what the problem is. So instead of pouring money into our governments so they can, buy luxurious villas and expensive cars and live the lives of luxury, you just deprive them of that and, and make some conditions for, helping them. On the other hand, and I'm really apologizing, it's not my intention to be offensive to anyone, but from where I'm sitting, looking at Europe and the US, I'm afraid you are going by the way of Yugoslavia, not the other way around. And it's been terrifying and also kind of comforting, because it helped me accept that we're not uniquely insane. We had a decent standard of living. We lived together. We had a country that needed changing, but could have been one of the very influential countries in the EU today. And we assumed it's not going to go away. It was just also funny and to talk about nationalism and to go back to history. We ended up 30 years later poor and miserable. And so I'm just saying I hope
You're
I
thinking
see
of
the rest of the world going
Trump in the US. They're thinking of the way the US elections are run. What are the other examples that make you think, well, don't take all of this for granted?
Well, I mean, the US is kind of obvious with, in our case, it was ethnic tensions, and in that case, it's racial tensions. Brexit, the similar story. France today also, not really knowing what to do with the issue of, terrorism, but then just grouping everyone together. Then having Orban and, Poland controlling Europe and, saying, well, we're just going to block your budget if you want us to have rule of law. So, I mean, from where I'm sitting, I'm not really, I'd like Europe and US to help themselves first before coming to rescue.
Yeah. We were talking about this earlier. There's a lot of support or admiration within Croatia which has recently joined the EU, for Orban and his line of politics. And I know Slovenia has a leader that is quite close to Orban too.
Yes, and it's, and I honestly, I've come to the point in life where I don't really believe in nationalism as a power in a society. I really think it's just a very skillful manipulation and preparation of the environment for nationalists to lead groups of people and make them believe in what they're preaching until they discover they've been tricked into surrendering a decent life.
Okay, if our panelists can stay with us, we're just running over time a bit. We've got a question from Diane Cook, and then I want to put another question to you. Diane, go ahead. I think you're following up on Sabina's comments here too. Go on, Diane.
I was in some ways encouraged Sabina, because I think the Anglo-Saxon world is an example of how not to do things, and perhaps we could do with some of your enthusiasm about the opposite. But do you see that what you're saying, that there are your friends, your acquaintances, and what you read in the papers or listen to on social media and stuff, do you think that's going to be more widespread in Bosnia? That type of view that you've expressed, that, like, we're on our own, so we have to make it work.
There was some, I mean, both Valerie and Sabina, I think you've noted this, there's a party called Naša stranka, which is our party, which has done quite well in recent elections. There's a rejection of nationalist politicians that you feel has done quite well in the municipal elections. Is that right? So, maybe Valerie can talk about that, and then Sabina. Valerie.
Well, I think Sabina would know better than I have, but I do think she mentioned already the tremendous result in the recent local elections 2 weeks ago in Bosnia. That was a big victory for sort of anti-nationalist, more social democratic, multi-ethnic forces. I mean, the mayor of central, Sarajevo was under siege, the longest siege in modern warfare, 44 months, and now the mayor of the center of the city is a Serb, actually, and of course he has a very specific history from the right before Yugoslavia collapsed. But anyways, and in other big cities, they also elected young reformist mayors. But more to the question, I have seen quite a lot of essays and quite a lot of my friends saying, and especially members of the Bosnian diaspora living in the United States, for instance, who are very scared because they remember the path to war in Yugoslavia, and they start to see really the same level of division and tension and polarization and rhetoric from political leaders in a way that, of course, is not repeating but rhyming quite a lot. And I do have a lot of conversations with my friends in Bosnia about how they see Europe, and I do think. Sabina's articulated it very well, but I think many people are very worried about what it means as well, especially to see this in some of the bigger European countries and America.
We are running out of time, but I'm this is me being selfish, but I'm desperate to ask this question. There's a huge amount of news coverage about Holocaust denial. We see a big focus on what Germany is doing and what it's done to track down perpetrators of crimes during the Second World War. Yet, Sabina, you must be aware that there are serving policemen in Republika Srpska and also in Serbia who have taken part in war crimes that are never going to be held to account for them. How do you deal with that? And also, can you see a level of hypocrisy in that? It's something that I've always find hard to resonate. On the one hand, we do look very closely and quite rightly at what happened during the Second World War, yet we tend to marginalize and forget what happened during the wars in both Bosnia and Kosovo.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I think that, there are a lot of people who should be maybe prosecuted and never will, but I'm not sure that everyone who should have been prosecuted for Holocaust was. And I'm not sure that, you didn't have people, I don't know, being art collectors or, engineers or successful this and that who were not in one way or another implicated in Holocaust. So I think that what's important is to reach the point where you cannot deny what happened, where there are no alternative facts. And you say that plainly, this is what happened and we're not going to debate this. And it's illegal under law. But I'm not even sure about that. And I actually think, Mr. Jim, maybe you know better than me, but I think Germany after World War II, it wasn't easy ride either. They didn't recognize straight away. They didn't. It took years and years for ordinary Germans to face what happened on their behalf, in their name. So it's a process, I guess, and it's not fair, but it's also, I don't know, maybe after all this time, we haven't dealt with that straight away. We need to let it come naturally now. We waited long enough. Let's not antagonize people further. And
I agree.
just accept not everyone is going to be prosecuted. Not everyone is going to be faced to justice. I guess they just have to live with themselves. That has to be enough. I would rather. I'm always happier as a victim, than as.
It's out of. Partly out of political necessity, but also for society to heal. And France did the same with the Vichy politicians, and the US did it with people involved in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a question to me or not.
But question to you, yeah.
I think I was very interested to hear what Sabina said, which in a way boils down to the concept of time heals all wounds, or at least heals some wounds. War crimes, the judicial process of dealing with war crimes has a number of objectives. And one is just simple justice, and another is deterrence. To try to reduce the likelihood that those will happen again in a different situation. But also part of the notion of reconciliation. And I'm not sure at this stage it's actually furthering reconciliation 25 years later. I think something that Sabina said is really important is an effort to come to grips, to understanding of a common history, people in Bosnia and other parts of the Balkans now, they learn their own national history, and it's very different. So and I can see that in the students I teach in Kosovo, believe me, and from what they might get from their neighbors who happen to be a different ethnicity. I think it's really important to find ways to encourage the natural tendency, to a certain extent, of people to want to live together peacefully. And I think part of that is a common history aimed at reconciliation. So, at some point, you have to decide. You've had 25 years, maybe it's enough for the process of war criminals, especially for those who were at the lower end of the spectrum, and move on with creating a new life. That's not something a lot of people want to hear, but I think it's realistic.
Right. Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. Do stay on the line if you've got any more comments or questions. We've got an additional briefing. I'm going to say thanks to all our participants, first of all. That's to Valerie Hopkins from the Financial Times, Louis Sell, speaking from his home in Maine, and also Sabina Niksic there in Sarajevo. Thank you very much to all three of you. It's been really, really interesting.